How's your hammer? PTDevil here. It's been a long road to get here. We've had some trials and tribulations, frantic frustrations, dueling sensations that are sweeping the nations. But now that we're reaching the end of the road, I think it's appropriate to take a little retrospective to look back at how we got to this point. I'm doing this partly so I can give my thoughts on this series as a whole, but mainly and more importantly, to give a Cliff Notes summary version of each archetype in order to make it easier on anyone joining the Deck Doctor's Destruction Derby to stick to that deck's playstyle. So with that in mind, let's take a stroll down memory lane and look back at the shit show that came before. Picking up where my parent series left off, Guardians are an archetype that really shouldn't have been one. Mainly due to the fact that it never had a playstyle to begin with, but also because just about every language had already mistranslated earlier cards to be a part of the archetype that were never intended to be, resulting in the greatest localization mishap museum ever to be printed on a single card. Fixing that was the first step, making this one of three, well technically four, Deck Doctor's patients to feature erratas for existing members. Step 2 involved designing an actual play style which stick to what themes the original series had while also making them playable. The main win condition of the new support revolves around Greater Guardian equipped with Pot G. The former being immune to battle destruction while forcing the opponent to attack it allows it to rack up counters on the latter, which helps give it massive attack and protections. It even has an Omni Negate which can be used as a last resort or even a disruption if you have another equip on the field. Other key cards in strategy include Arsenal Hall to help utilize the original Guardians and search out the equips, Royal Guardian to give quicker access to Greater Guardian and bypass her summoning conditions, and Hunter Guardian for even easier access to the equips in a way that synergizes really well with the new field spell. Overall, it's a huge improvement over the original, even though that's not saying much. Moving on to Blackluster Soldier, otherwise known as Diet Chaos, is one of those classic archetypes that never seem to gain any traction even though it's clear that an attempt was made for it. They have a pretty high power ceiling with banishing spot removal and easy summoning conditions for an early series, but poor consistency and non-existent protection makes it the very definition of a glass cannon. The former is assisted mainly by Morning Dawn Knight and Sinful Knight and Restoration, while the latter is helped by damn near everything else. Sinful Soldier gives some much needed negation, Envoy of the Morning Dawn and Retribution both offer blanket protection, and Chaos Knight lets you reactively make your BLS monsters immune to just about anything for a turn. Their new boss monster, Chaos Dragon Master Knight, becomes a fantastic win condition for the deck by doing both of the above, allowing your monsters to be treated as both light and dark simultaneously to facilitate easier chaos summoning, and letting it become immune to all card effects on a trigger by shuffling your banished monsters into the deck. It also has a massive attack, starting at 5k and gaining more for each banished monster, so with this new support the deck has become a lot more deserving of the legacy that it's left behind. By far my most popular episode is the Entities video, a fact which I have somewhat mixed feelings on. On the one hand, I'm glad it was one of my favorite archetypes which got royally shafted by Konami, as evidenced by Entity not technically being a proper archetype, the only patient in the entire series to have that distinction. But on the other hand, this is easily the episode which I made the most mistakes on, and that's even including the one that I ended up scrapping entirely. As a result, the final product is almost unrecognizable from what it was in the original episode. The main goal, however, has remained virtually unchanged, as the overall win condition of the new support is still split between Azathoth OTK, Oryx Control, and Cthulhu Turbo. What remained of the main deck is designed to help get these three at full power a lot easier by spamming Fusion, Synchro, and Xyz monsters as quickly as possible. A lot of the extra deck toolbox also helps with this. Norden was errated to do what it was supposed to without being broken. Bastet recycles the fusion you used to bring her out. Yig lets you immediately search any fusion, so yes please. Kiaiga is the perfect synchro tuner with a continuous graveyard effect. Althea is a free mind control and the first Xyz tuner in the whole game. And Lukthu lets you cheat out your synchros with very little effort. I can't say it's any better than the original deck, mostly because it doesn't exist, but at least it's something that gives these cards the power that they finally deserved. Arguably the most memeable archetype I've ever reviewed is Red Eyes, because for all their talk about potential, they sure seem insistent on squandering it left and right. Considering how many waves of support this archetype had, it's a little surprising that absolutely none of them have any synergy with one another. I recognize that this is a bit of a pot-kettle situation, since this new support introduces a brand new mechanic to the archetype which has little to nothing to do with the rest. However, it does take into consideration a lot of what little themes the deck already had, such as tributing, a focus on the graveyard, and even some Slash Dragon synergy. The main win condition of this wave in particular is Scale Metal Dragon, who can utilize the new Metal Morph clone to gain some massive damage outputs and run over just about anything. Alternatively, you could also use Dual Blast Dragon in order to go for Massive Burn Dragon with Inferno Fire Blast. Either way, it's a major improvement over the existing support, though it still remains to be seen if it's enough. In terms of disparity between pre- and post-deck doctors, no archetype is as extreme as Arcana Force. The archetype is terrible, with their gamble mechanic leaning far too much into high-risk, low-reward territory to be considered worth running. As a result, I ended up severely overcompensating for this in the original iteration of the support, to the point where it became easily the most unbalanced archetype of the series. It does add a pendulum mechanic to the deck out of nowhere, mainly due to the sheer volume of needed support to fill out the Arcanum, while having them perform double duty as the spell trap support that the archetype desperately needed. The deck still doesn't have a clear win condition aside from generic control effects from cards like the Star, the Reaper, and Justice. However, Judgment, the World, and the Chaos Ruler are all fantastic boss monsters to work toward making, even though the best way to getting to the former two is limited to reading, which is its own can of worm zeros to deal with. However, it's still a marked improvement over the Dump Starfire which we had to put up with until now. The next archetype was another accidental archetype, albeit one that went in the exact opposite direction. Ninjas suffer not from a lack of focus, but from a number of members that fall into the archetype unintentionally, clogging up their playstyle. However, their biggest issue is in their speed and their power, both of which are surprisingly lacking for an archetype based around deadly assassins. Any deck that revolves around using trap cards to make their basic plays is just asking for trouble. The new support revolves around Green Ninja, allowing you to use your ninjutsu arts right out of the gate in order to actually make plays. Kosuke and Rokuro are especially handy alongside Duplication, and Ryuji gives you instant access to just about any of the dragon ninjas you would need at the moment. Their new boss monster, Yukimura, also helps to pave the way for a win condition by granting solid protection and a high attack stat to beat over other monsters. Overall, it makes the deck playable in a modern setting, which is honestly all that they really needed. Like I said in the original video, I don't think dangers are bad. I would be filleted where I stand if I actually made that claim. However, with no archetypal win condition, or even anything resembling a win condition for that matter, there's no incentive to play the deck the way it was intended, resulting in it being left as the town bicycle for other meta decks. With the new support, they finally have one in the form of Death Worm providing spell speed 4 spot removal, Kraken being a major beater, and Last Stand setting the stage for the high attack stats to have free reign on the field. Mokele and Containment Breach are also fantastic swarming aids which can let you get as much use out of Kraken's multi-attacking effect as possible, letting him easily attack up to 6 times per turn. Thankfully, all of these options lock the user hard into the archetype, meaning that there's little chance of them being abused like the rest of the archetype. There's nothing that can be done about preventing the engine, so the very least we can do is incentivize playing it. My personal favorite was the Mayakashi archetype, which may have just been the victim of Konami's paranoia on supporting zombie decks. Insert Eldritch comment here. True, they do have one of the most consistent infinite loops in the game, but it also hard locks you out of any outside support from the extra deck, meaning that said extra deck needs to be powerful enough to stand on its own and not die completely to a stiff breeze. The main insurance policy of the new support is the field spell Yokai Shrine, which allows the player to get a mulligan against the deck's main weakness of non-destruction removal, to ensure that you don't end up losing the entire Synchro ladder to a single Nibiru. The other graveyard revival options can also be used to trigger the synchros, or even revive Kappa or AZ Yuki in order to let them dominate the field. The new main deck monsters are also vital to the deck, with Kawako offering much needed summoning protection and banishing recycling, Maneki providing an important alternative to Daki, and Okura being a constant graveyard revival. I feel somewhat confident that I didn't let my personal feelings get in the way of designing this new support fairly, and I do feel like the support does a fantastic job at letting the deck shine the way it was meant to. Coming off one of my favorite episodes to one of my least favorite, Ojamas are a bit of a mixed bag of fuckery. They're really good at generating a ton of empty advantage, but they have no way of making use of that advantage, and their control effects are severely underwhelming, meaning that they have no real win condition on their own. I regret relying too heavily on Kieran on this one, as this was another severely unbalanced result, but the broad strokes of the support were still right on target. The Ojama Trio retrains help extremely well with both control and consistency by giving you free negates and treating themselves as their respective OG Ojamas. Armed Dragon Rider and Mecha Ojama King are both great boss monsters that allow them to use the quote-unquote support cards that were made for Chaz decks without having to sacrifice their consistency by actually including Armed Dragons or Machine Unions. I still have nightmares occasionally due to having to analyze the artworks of this archetype a little too closely, but at least I can say my conscience is clear with designing this one. Looking back, I'm still a bit flabbergasted by the Karibo episode, not because it was particularly interesting or different, but because I'm still surprised that I had to do it at all. Considering how integral they are to the series, it's borderline inexcusable how they still don't have a deck of their own and are only even barely considered an archetype. Obviously I couldn't let this stand, but the result wound up being a lot different than anyone would have expected out of this archetype. Sure, it still relies on the control effects that they're well known for, but who among us would have anticipated Karibo OTK as being a reliable strategy? The main goal of the deck is to amass as many Karibo monsters as possible while Village is on the field, then combine them into a Curry Babylon with a game-winning attack stack and swing for a direct hit using Rainbow Blessing. It also helps if you control Rainbow Karibo at the time of activation, since the latter then locks the opponent out of using card effects during the battle phase, thereby all but ensuring victory if you're able to pull it off. Of course, this is reliant on having a lot of very specific monsters on board, so it's not the most reliable, but with the amount of new and existing control effects in the archetype, it should be able to happen eventually. It's a bit unconventional, but at the very least, it's something that they can finally call their own. The Celtic Guard video was an interesting one to work on. It is by far the smallest archetype in the series, clocking in at a grand total of 3 cards, 2 of which don't do jack shit for anyone, let alone the deck. So it's the closest thing to a blank slate that I've ever had in this series. I decided to take what little effect theming I had by focusing on a playstyle that emphasizes the graveyard by cycling cards through the hand, using the Resolute to empty your hand and swarm the field, then using Noble Arms to replenish the hand and repeat the process. It also places emphasis on the original Celtic Guardian, though with a Summon Skull-like extra deck, which allows it to serve as legitimate boss monsters with all the graveyard effects and equips boosting them up. It still comes a bit out of nowhere, but let's be honest, just about anything would be out of place in a non-archetypal archetype like this. Another contender for the most memeable episode would have to be Goblins.
Goblinか?
Jokes aside, this was actually a unique case of being yet another accidental archetype without any defined playstyle, but with a plethora of members clogging up the archetype, making defining said playstyle virtually impossible. The closest thing we got to such is the Goblin Attack Force series, which is what I decided to focus on with the new support, being primarily beatdown focused by swarming the field with high attack goblins. Ironically, it also places a focus on having defense position goblins, since both Rally Squad and Battle Hunger both require them in order to go off. Another key card is Ambush Tactic, since it allows cards like Scrounging Goblin and Decoy Squad to proc their effects on turn 1 in order to start gaining advantage. It's not great in the current meta, but a simple beatdown strategy is still something worth playing around with once in a while. The Dark Lord video is the one which was the victim of incredibly poor timing, being released a mere 4 days before Konami announced new support for the archetype. However, while the new official support does a great job at dealing with the archetype's win condition, it still leaves it with an issue of out-resourcing itself before it can achieve said win condition. Arcadia is still the main tool for maintaining said advantage, while Joan and Valkyria help to get to him faster. However, Iskar is the true star of the custom support, as she sets up your graveyard in order to use the Dark Lord effect with whatever you need. Whether it be spot removal, effect negation, or even frickin' fusion summoning. Though considering the official support, I would say Temptation stands above the rest of the spell traps, as it lets you revive and recycle Morningstar, which is now a very critical piece of the strategy. I question whether I would still go through with this if the video had been even a week late, but the support still fills a clear and present hole that the archetype needs to have patched up. The last of the Rada ripoffs was the Reptilian video, which was a really interesting one to work on. They had a very clear archetype design, but not only is this synchro archetype severely lacking in synchro monsters, but their main gimmick of total attack reduction was left woefully underrepresented. The new support does away with these problems and then some, as both Stone Garden and Stheno allow for massive attack reduction of just about everything that isn't blanket immune to card effects. Speaking of Stheno, she and Uriel are also fantastic boss monsters for the archetype, being able to take full advantage of the opponent's zero attack monsters by locking out their effects and tributing them away. Overall, it's a marked improvement and something that the archetype really deserved considering how much potential it had. The other victim of poor timing in the series was the Charmer video, though it's not nearly as bad as the Dark Lord one due to being stymied shortly before it was released instead of after, and because the new support doesn't really do a whole hell of a lot. At the very least, they recognized that the back row for the archetype was critical, but even with all of them active, their win condition is still too reliant on favorable matchups in order to be the least bit reliable. The new support gives the archetype the consistency it desperately needs, as their new continuous spell allows you to freely control the attributes of all monsters summoned, meaning that you'll almost never be without a target for your effects. It also gives the archetype an actually formidable boss monster in the form of Teresa, who gains conditional immunity to monster effects and allows you to steal the opponent's monsters fairly freely. I'm somewhat surprised about how little I had to change in order to accommodate the new support, but I'm also mostly glad that this fan-favorite archetype finally gets the chance to shine that it so rightly deserved. The last episode, or episodes rather, is the two-parter finale for the Archfiend archetype. It's a massive archetype, as evidenced by how I needed to split it into 2 parts to review everything. But even with 4 distinct and different playstyles, there were still a few themes that came up that I could use to create a unifying theme. This playstyle focuses on gaining advantage through destruction and manipulating life point costs and die rolls. The main cards for the former involve Black Archfiend and Little Skull, while the latter is done primarily with using Time Blitz in tandem with either Master King or Imperial Queen, in order to pay whatever amount of life points will benefit you most in this situation. There's also no shortage of boss monsters to choose from either, from the previous 2 mentioned Master King and Imperial Queen, the RDAs, Archfiend Emperor, and even some of these Summoned Skull retrains being particularly good examples. I think it ended up a lot better than I expected going into it, and being the one which all of us involved were able to collaborate on it together, I'm glad that it ended up as such. And that's everything. A year and a half of my life condensed into less than half an hour of content. It's been a wild ride to say the least, but I believe it's always better to leave the audience wanting more than to overstay your welcome. Though on that note, of course we're not leaving the series just yet, as we've still got a whole tournament to get through first. But before that, there's still a bit more tweaking I have to do in order to get these decks in tip-top shape. Until then, thanks for watching, and until next time, don't get run over, and I'll see you guys later.